This video is part of an ongoing series of book reviews from the perspective of the magical philosophy of Thelema. Raja Yoga by Swami Vivekananda. The book's subtitle, Conquering the Internal Nature, is similar to Crowley's characterization of yoga as the training of the mind in Book 4, Part 1. And this is not the only similarity between the methodology Vivekananda outlines in Raja Yoga and the scientific illuminism taught in the Equinox. There is an appeal to personal verification in terms of religious experience. Vivekananda begins on the first page by stating, all our knowledge is based upon experience. Both he and Crowley are writing against the backdrop of the modern origin of religious studies as a field, as represented, for example, by William James' The Varieties of Religious Experience. This context of thought, like that of comparative religion, occurs as part of the history of colonial globalization, and necessarily involves the superimposition of originally Western, which is to say European colonial, categories of interpretation, a process that simultaneously erases and also potentially refreshes the subaltern traditions in question, especially when indigenous agents, such as Vivekananda, proactively participate in the process of modernizing, so-called, their own cultural traditions. This is a process that confounds and complicates any simplistic conclusions that the postmodern liberal Puritan might wish to draw about cultural appropriation. Certainly an important subject that I don't want to minimize. But what happens when, as in the case of modern India, indigenous intellectuals enthusiastically assimilate Western ideas, such as science, make them their own, and effectively turn the tables on the Christian missionaries by promoting Vedanta as the universal human religion, with Europeans as the converts? Regarding the issue of cultural appropriation, I think it's wise, instead of jumping to conclusions based too quickly on naively binary moral oppositions, I choose to suspend premature judgment, read carefully, understand contextually and historically, and then, and only then, critically evaluate. Raja Yoga breaks down the practice of yoga in terms of 8 canonical stages of practice, called Ashtanga Yoga. That just means eightfold in Sanskrit. This sequence is replicated within the system of mysticism taught by the AA, Crowley's magical teaching order. For example, in the ordering of the chapters of Book 4, Part 1, a text which in places almost seems like a rewrite of Raja Yoga. The 8 stages of Ashtanga Yoga are Yama, avoidance of unethical behavior, Niyama, practice of sanctity, Asana, posture, Pranayama, or breath control, Pratyahara, defined as the restraint of the senses from their objects, Dharana, concentration, not to be confused with dhyana, which is successful concentration, and Samadhi, which is called superconsciousness by Vivekananda. The 3 middle chapters of the book are devoted to discussing what Vivekananda calls the psychic prana, and these are perhaps the most dated parts of the book, based on vitalist conceptions of the life force that were common in the early 20th century, but which no longer have a serious place in biology. Here and elsewhere in this text, it is useful to supplement the discussion by ahistorically introducing a phenomenological method. By phenomenologically bracketing yogic experience in this manner, the examples given can be more carefully separated from the version of scientific positivism that Vivekananda is contextually appealing to. And this enables their potential value to be examined in a more nuanced manner. In particular, it does need to be acknowledged that yogic experience is interpreted and is interpretive, and thereby shaped by the practitioner based upon the ideological assumptions of their hermeneutical foresight. Yogic experience is not a pure encounter with reality, as if there could be any such thing. And this constructivist interpretation, which I do advocate, is often at odds with the more naively realist accounts of yogic experience that one does sometimes encounter in the literature. Rereading Raja Yoga, I feel I gained a better understanding of what pratyahara is. Previously, I treated it as an attitude towards practice rather than as itself a practice, but now I think I've gained some understanding of how withdrawal of the senses from external perception can be practiced as a specific stage of yoga distinguishable from dharana, which would be the further concentration of that separated attention. On the other hand, the distinction between dhyana and samadhi continues to seem vague in this text, just as it does in the first part of Book 4. Saying that samadhi is the prolongation of dhyana is not very helpful. Vivekananda does a little better when he writes that, quote, when one has so intensified the power of dhyana as to be able to reject the external part of perception and remain meditating only on the internal part, the meaning, that state is called samadhi, unquote. Yet it's quite unclear what this means, especially since the lower stage of pratyahara has already been defined in terms of this distinction. Nor is it clear why this distinction is of such crucial spiritual significance in the first place. The ability to break up mental experience and categorize it in this manner says nothing in and of itself about what the significance of these categories are for the person making these distinctions. Ultimately, one's own personal experience must serve as the benchmark for these discriminations. Or to put it another way, you have to test the method of yoga by practicing it oneself. The closest to a phenomenological description of samadhi is in the 7th chapter, where Vivekananda compares and contrasts the unconscious trance of samadhi with normal dreamless sleep. Although the two states are otherwise superficially indistinguishable, he claims samadhi is different from slumber because it imparts knowledge. Quote, when he, the sleeper, returns from his sleep, he is the same man who went into it. No enlightenment comes. But when a man goes into samadhi, if he goes into it a fool, he comes out a sage. Unquote. This phenomenon leads Vivekananda to posit that, quote, the mind itself has a higher state of existence beyond reason, a superconscious state, and when the mind gets to that higher state, then this knowledge, beyond reasoning, comes to man. Unquote. The gist of these passages is very close to Crowley's remarks in the introduction to Book 4, Part 1, that the function of yoga is to facilitate creative genius. In other words, samadhi can be defined as a noetic, as a mental trance, the practice of which affects a hermeneutical totalization of the psyche that is greater than the sum of the parts, or a gestalt of the self that is cognate with what Thelemic philosophy calls the true will. Clearly, the whole of this theory stands in need of personal, practical experimentation to even begin to adequately critique it. In conclusion, Raja Yoga is an authoritative introduction to the interdenominational grouping of psycho-spiritual exercises called yoga, which form the basis of mysticism, which along with ceremonial magic forms one of the twin pillars of practice synthesized in Thelemic magic. It lays out the 8 stages of Ashtanga yoga, which provide an adequately Catholic set of procedures for the training of the mind, suitable for most magical aspirants, while also giving access to a traditional body of knowledge with a long history of practical application from which the practitioner can learn. Meditation is an important practice, as important really as ceremonial magic in the system of scientific illuminism. The equanimity cultivated by yoga can be a valuable antidote to the emotions stirred up by magical activities. If ceremony is the active path, then meditation is the passive way to attainment. Sometimes the ability to remain calm, be still, and wait patiently is just as important to the actualization of the true will as more obviously proactive dispositions.